Hello. In this video, I'm going to analyze an argument against the wrongness of abortion that I call the right to refuse argument. And I'm going to argue that the final version of this argument succeeds in justifying its conclusion. In other words, it succeeds in establishing the claim that it's not wrong to get an abortion in certain cases. Now, the basic idea behind this argument is that it's not wrong to refuse to have procreative sex. Okay? I expect most people to agree with that premise. And once we see the relevant similarities between that and getting an abortion, you should be moved to agree that it's also not wrong to get an abortion. Okay, let's get to it. Here's the central claim that I'll be defending in this video. It's not wrong to get an abortion in the early unwanted pregnancy case. So let me describe that case. It's before the fetus develops the capacity to feel pain, have desires, exercise autonomy, etc. And the person did not intend to get pregnant and does not want to carry a child to term. Now, by making this the central claim of this video, I don't mean to imply that it is wrong to get an abortion in other cases. This claim entails nothing about the morality of other cases. You need separate arguments for those. All the argument purports to establish is that in this case, it's not wrong to get an abortion. Okay, now let's get to the first case from which we'll be constructing the first version of our argument. I call this the one opportunity case, or the OO case. Person X and person Y, who have compatible reproductive organs, have the opportunity to have sex and attempt to conceive a child. This will be their one and only opportunity to do so. Person X is willing and is the one who would carry the child if one is conceived. Person Y is undecided. And here is argument A. Okay? Premise A1, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the OO case. Premise A2, it's not wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the OO case, so, conclusion, it's not wrong to get an abortion in the EU case. Okay, now expect pretty much everyone to agree with the second premise here. It's not wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the OO case. So let's take a look at the first premise. The first premise is connecting the wrongness of one of these things to the wrongness of the other thing. Premise A1 says, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the OO case. Now, to defend a premise like this, you're going to want to point to the morally relevant similarities between the two things. You're going to want to point to the features of the first thing such that if they were to make the first thing wrong, then the second thing would also have to be wrong for similar reasons. So, what are the morally relevant similarities here? Well, both involve depriving something of the chance of a future life like ours in order to exercise control over what happens with one's body. Now, this idea of appealing to a future like ours comes from philosopher Marquis. I've put the reference in the description below. Now, he's actually against abortion, so he almost certainly would not endorse this argument. Towards the end of the paper, he starts to discuss these sorts of things when he's getting into the ethics of contraception, but I'm not satisfied with some of the things he says there. Okay, now in response to this point, someone might ask, well, what is the thing being deprived of a future like ours in the OO case, right? In the case of refusing to have procreative sex. We'll note that every sperm-egg pair, right, every possible combination of a sperm and an egg has the chance of resulting in a unique human. So insofar as you refuse to have sex in the OO case, you are depriving millions of such sperm-egg pairs of the chance of a future like ours. Now, to object to this premise, you're going to want to point to a difference between the two cases and then argue that it's morally relevant. So here's a potential objection. Well, first you might say, by refusing to have sex in the OO case, all you're doing is depriving these sperm-egg pairs of a chance, a very, very small chance of a future like ours. But when you get an abortion, right, that fetus would have definitely had a future like ours if not for getting the abortion. Right? Now, the response to this is that's not quite correct. There might be a miscarriage, the child might not live to have a future like ours, so it's not actually true that the fetus is guaranteed to have a future like ours. So let's put the objection another way. Instead, you might say, okay, the chance of an early fetus having a future life is enormously greater than the chance of one of the sperm-egg pairs having one. So when you get an abortion, what you're doing is you're destroying a huge chance, a very large chance of having a future like ours. But when you refuse to have sex in the OO case, all you're doing is destroying a very, very tiny chance of resulting in a future like ours. So we're going to revise the case to attempt to get around this. So that brings us to case 2, pregnancy guarantee, okay, or the PG case. Just like before, person X and person Y who have compatible reproductive organs have the opportunity to have sex and attempt to conceive a child. This will be their one and only opportunity to do so. Person X is willing and is the one who would carry the child. Person Y is undecided. Okay, now here's the new part. Person X wears a special pregnancy device during sex that will guarantee that a sperm fertilizes an egg and causes a pregnancy. Okay, so they have a special pregnancy guaranteeing device. Okay, so now let's use this new case to construct the second version of the argument. Argument B. Premise B1, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the PG case. B2, it's not wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the PG case. So, it's not wrong to get an abortion in the EU case. Once again, I expect premise B2 to be pretty much uncontroversial. Okay, I expect almost everyone to agree that it's not wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex, even now when we have the pregnancy guaranteeing device. So the question is, should we accept premise B1? So again, premise B1 says, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the PG case. Now what's the defense of this premise? Well, now the chance of a sperm-egg pair having a future life is the same as the chance of a fetus having one. With this pregnancy guaranteeing device, we can guarantee that if you have sex, a pregnancy will result, and so whatever the chance of an early pregnancy having a future life like ours is the exact same chance of this sperm-egg pair having a future life like ours. Okay, but what are the morally relevant differences here that you could use to object to this premise? Well, here's one. Even if the chance of some sperm-egg pair or other having a future life is high, the chance of any particular one having a future life is still enormously small, since there are millions of such pairs. So again, any particular one, there's an overwhelmingly small chance that that's going to be the one to have a future life like ours. Whereas in the case of the early abortion, there is already a particular individual that has a moderately high chance of having a future life, and you'd be depriving it of that chance. Okay? So I think there's another easy fix that we can make which will get around this problem. And that brings us to case 3. I call this case the targeted guarantee, or the TG case. Just like before, person X and person Y who have compatible reproductive organs have the opportunity to have sex and attempt to conceive a child. This will be their one and only opportunity to do so. Person X is willing and is the one who would carry the child to term. Person Y is undecided. Now, here's the added twist. Person X wears a special device during sex that will guarantee that a particular sperm fertilizes a particular egg, namely the ones with the greatest combined mass, and causes a pregnancy. Let's call this particular sperm-egg pair with the greatest combined mass out of all the possible sperm-egg pairs that person X and Y have, the massive pair. So, this brings us to the third argument, argument C, or the third version of our argument. Premise C1, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the TG case. Premise C2, it's not wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the TG case, so it's not wrong to get an abortion in the EU case. Once again, I don't expect to have lost anyone on the second premise. I think most people are going to agree it's not wrong to refuse to have sex in the TG case, even when you have the device that will guarantee that a particular sperm fertilizes a particular egg and results in a pregnancy. Now, let's think about this first premise. Okay, premise C1 again says, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to refuse to have sex in the TG case. Now the defense of this premise, now there's a particular sperm-egg pair, namely the massive pair, that has the same chance of a future life as the early fetus does. So just as in the case of abortion, there's a particular thing, namely the fetus, that has a high chance of a future like ours, and you'd be depriving it of that chance by getting an abortion. In the TG case, there's a particular thing, namely the massive pair, that has a very high chance of having a future like ours, and you'd be depriving it of that chance by refusing to have sex in the TG case. All right, now I'm going to consider a list of objections, and I'm going to address them one by one. Okay? Here are some potentially morally relevant differences between the two actions. First, one victim exists, the other doesn't. Okay? Second, one victim is a person or a human being, and the other isn't. Third, one action involves unwanted sex, and the other doesn't. Fourth, one is an act of killing, and the other isn't. Fifth, one life already began, and the other didn't. And sixth, this one's a little bit abstract, one is an action, and the other is inaction. We're going to go through these in order. First, objection 1, existence. Now this objection is based on the notion of existence, and to discuss it is going to involve a little bit of metaphysics, so I apologize if you find that distasteful. This objection goes like this. In one case, there actually exists a victim, but there doesn't exist a victim in the other case. Okay? Now, in response to this, I'm going to say this is not true. Okay? Both cases involve a victim that really exists. They're just very different sorts of things. One is a fetus, and the other is a sperm-egg pair. The sperm-egg pair that we're calling the massive pair, it's an object that really exists. It's a scattered object, much like the solar system, so it's not an ordinary object whose parts are more unified, spatially speaking, but insofar as you believe in things like the solar system that have one part over there, and another part way over here, and another part way far off somewhere else, you should be open to the idea that there exist scattered objects like this. The massive pair is a lot like this. It has one part over there in one person, it has another part over here in this other person, and the two parts may never come close together to be unified, but that doesn't change the fact that the thing, the pair, exists. It has a mass, it has a center of mass, it exists. Now, in the branch of philosophy called ontology, that deals with questions of what exists, it's actually the dominant position, or one of the dominant positions, that such scattered objects really do exist. Now, that doesn't mean that the view is correct, but what it does mean is that you should take it seriously. And it also means that an objection to our moral argument based on this highly controversial ontological assumption that such things don't exist is not going to be that compelling. So now, let's consider the second objection. All right? This is based on personhood or humanity. And this is going to involve a little bit more metaphysics. So again, I'm sorry. This one says, okay, maybe both victims exist, but they're very different sorts of things, and that difference is morally relevant. Okay? One victim is a person/human being, but the other is not. All right, so how will I respond to this? Well, first, let's just grant that the fetus is indeed a person or a human being. Okay? Let's grant the opposition the claim that the person or human being comes into existence at the moment of conception. All right? However, let's not be confused by our language. Okay? Let's not be confused by the fact that we already have a term in our language for one thing, but not for another. Okay? So the massive pair may not be a person or a human being, but it is a schmerson or a human schmeing. Okay? I'm coining those terms myself, the term schmerson and the term human schmeing. What is a schmerson or a human schmeing? Well, I drew a diagram to help us out here. Let me get this here. Can you see that? Okay, good. So we have time going in that direction. Okay? So here is where, let's say, the sperm-egg pair forms. Okay? Whichever component of the sperm-egg pair forms later, let's just say it's the sperm, this is the point at which the sperm-egg pair comes into existence. Okay? The sperm gets formed. This is where the two people swipe right on each other on Tinder. Okay? This is where they bang. And then here, this is where the person is showing signs of pregnancy. Now the green, this is a representation of the lifetime of a schmerson, or a human schmeing, right? The schmerson, or the human schmeing, comes into existence long before the person or the human being, okay? But notice that the lifetimes of the person/human being overlaps the lifetime of the schmerson human schmeing for at least part of the life, okay? So the only difference between a person/human being on the one hand and a schmerson/human schmeing on the other hand is that the latter has an origin before the former. Okay, the latter comes into existence long before the former, but they're very similar in other ways. Okay, let me put that back. Okay, so if you're watching this right now, you probably take yourself to be a person or a human being, and you're right, that's what you are. However, in the very chair in which you're sitting right now, there's another thing. There's a Schmerzen/human being. You share a body with this thing. You share experiences with this thing. And you share your whole life with this thing, okay? The only difference between you and it is that its origin was long before yours. At the point at which you came into existence, and we can grant that's conception, you two have been entirely overlapping objects. To use a term from metaphysics, right? If objects are divided into temporal parts, right? Just as we're divided into spatial parts along the spatial dimensions, if we're divided into temporal parts along the temporal dimension, you, the person, human being, are a temporal part of the Schmerzen, human being. Okay, so now that we've got these new terms on the table, Schmerzen and human being, let's get back to the moral questions. So this objection is saying, look, here's the morally relevant difference. One of these things is a person/human being, and the other isn't. Okay, and my response is, that's fine. The other is not a person/human being, but it is a Schmerzen/human being. And the question is, why does that make a moral difference? Right? Now, if you're going to say a person/human being has rights, but a Schmerzen/human being doesn't, you're going to have to justify that claim. When we think of one thing as having certain rights and another thing as not having certain rights, there has to be some morally relevant difference between the two that can explain that. So once we see that the Schmerzen/human being really exists, we can ask this question. Why should a person/human being have an absolute right to its future life? A right that overrides bodily autonomy considerations, but a Schmerzen/human being doesn't. They're very similar sorts of things. They both have the chance of having a future life, and by taking the relevant action, you are depriving them of that chance. Okay, so I don't think this objection succeeds. Person/human beings on the one hand and Schmerzen/human beings on the other hand are not different in the relevant way. They both have the chance of a future like ours, so the action of depriving them of this is the same in both cases. I think the temptation to see this objection as compelling rests on being misled by language, by the fact that we have these terms in our language but not these other terms. Okay, so let's get to the next objection. Objection 3, unwanted sex, right? Having sex when you don't want to is a huge burden and imposition on one's freedom/bodily autonomy. So that's why it's not wrong to refuse to have sex. Now, my response to this objection is this. I think being pregnant, right, letting another human live inside your body when you don't want it to, is a much greater burden and imposition on one's freedom/bodily autonomy, right? In the case of having sex when you don't really feel like it, it's at most 5 or 10, or being generous, 12 minutes of discomfort, right? Whereas in the case of pregnancy, that's 9 months of letting another being live inside your body. Okay, so I just think it's false that the case of having sex is a bigger imposition on your freedom/bodily autonomy. So I don't think this objection succeeds. Now, the fourth objection is based on the distinction between killing versus not conceiving. This objection says it's much worse to kill than to fail to conceive. Now, my response to this is, why? Okay? Well, here are some reasons that killing might be wrong. Causing pain to the victim or the victim's loved ones, going against someone's preferences to live, violating someone's autonomy, causing instability or fear in society, etc. But note that none of the above apply in the cases we're considering. Here's the main reason we've been thinking about that it might be wrong to kill. Namely, it deprives something of the chance of a future life like ours. But this applies equally in both cases. So insofar as you find it plausible that this is the reason that it's wrong to kill, at least in typical situations, namely that it's wrong to deprive an individual of a future like ours, then this is not a morally relevant difference between the two. Okay, this applies in both cases. Now here's a very similar objection, already living versus not already living. This objection says something like, it's way worse to stop a life that's already begun than it is to prevent one from starting. Now my response to this is, again, why? This seems a little bit like status quo bias, right? To see the way things already are as sort of default justified over possible ways they could be. If it's wrong to stop a life that's already begun because it deprives something of a future life, right? If that's really the reason that it's wrong, then it should also be wrong to prevent one from starting or to fail to bring someone into existence. Again, they both deprive something of a future like ours. All right, this brings us to the last objection. Now, this last objection might have been implicit in some of the previous objections, but this one's a little bit more abstract. This is based on the distinction between action and inaction, or doing and allowing. Okay? So objection says this. In general, it's worse to do something bad, i.e. through an action, than it is to allow something bad to happen, i.e. through inaction. Now, I'll grant that this distinction is deeply intuitive for a lot of people, right? Intuitively, it's worse to be the one to throw the child in the pond to drown than to be the person who fails to go in to save the drowning child, right? Both might be bad, both probably are bad, but one is intuitively worse. Similarly, it might be worse intuitively to steal food from starving people than it is to fail to donate food to starving people. Again, both might be bad, both might be wrong, but intuitively, one is worse. So, we can grant this intuition. But note that even if we grant this general principle, it's not obvious that it's enough to make a difference in this case, right? Why think that bodily autonomy outweighs the wrongness of depriving someone of a future life through inaction, but not through action? In both cases, there are the bodily autonomy considerations. The person does not want to remain pregnant, and the person does not want to have sex. This objection is suggesting that the reason it's not wrong to refuse to have sex is because your bodily autonomy outweighs the wrongness of depriving someone of a future life through inaction, right, by failing to have sex. But, this objection continues, bodily autonomy does not outweigh the wrongness of depriving an individual of a future like ours through action, right, through getting an abortion. Why should we think that? Even if we believe in this doing-allowing distinction, or this action-inaction distinction, and we grant that it's morally relevant, why should we think that it's enough to make a difference in this case? Now, I think there's room for some debate here, but I think we can actually revise our argument one final time to avoid this objection. Okay, so this brings us to the final case, case 4, and I call this in process. Now the setup here is exactly like our previous case, the targeted guarantee case, right? We have these people with compatible reproductive organs, person X is willing and has the special device that will guarantee that the most massive sperm-egg pair will result in a pregnancy. Now here's the twist. Person Y is initially willing and so begins to have sex with person X, who wears the targeted pregnancy guaranteeing device. However, person Y changes their mind in the middle and wants to stop having sex. If person Y does nothing, the sex will continue and the child, created from the massive pair, will be conceived. So in this case, person Y wants to stop having sex, but if they do nothing, the sex will continue and the child will be conceived. The only way to stop this, the only way to prevent this, is to actively do something which stops the sex. Okay? That's important to get around this doing-allowing distinction. And that brings us to the final argument, argument D. Premise D1, if it's wrong to get an abortion in the EU case, then it's wrong for person Y to actively stop in the middle of the sex act in the IP case. Premise D2, it's not wrong for person Y to actively stop in the middle of the sex act in the IP case. Conclusion, so it's not wrong to get an abortion in the EU case. Now that we've gotten to our final version, I think that we have a very compelling argument here. The first premise now avoids the previous objections we've been considering. Now, both of these are actions you take. It's the action of getting an abortion in one case, and it's the action of actively stopping the sex act in the other case. And both actions are depriving something of the chance of a future like ours. And both actions are done in order to exercise bodily autonomy, or control over one's body. So, insofar as the first is wrong, the second should also be wrong. And I think almost everyone is still going to be on board for this second premise. You certainly don't do anything wrong by stopping a sex act in the middle. That is your right. Even if you started the sex originally to procreate, you do nothing wrong by stopping in the middle, by actively stopping the sex act. It's certainly not a good look to be denying this premise. So, that's why I think this argument succeeds in justifying the conclusion that it's not wrong to get an abortion in the early unwanted pregnancy case. But if you disagree, if you think you have some way of denying one of these premises, then I wish you good fortune in the culture wars to come. Now begins.